Southeast Radio's Business Matters with Carl Fitzpatrick.
Southeast Radio.
Well, Dalton Philips is the Chief Executive of the Dublin Airport Authority during a time in which the global aviation sector has witnessed unprecedented levels of turbulence. Dalton, prior to joining the DAA, your previous career, whilst not related to aviation, had taken you all over the world.
Morning, Carl. Thanks for having me on the show. I'm Irish, but I've been a nomad. So to give you some context, I've got 3 kids. One was born in Brazil, one was born in Germany, and one was born in Canada.
Wow.
So I've been in retail prior to aviation for 25 years, and I worked for 4 different companies. I worked for Walmart. I worked for the Westons, who own Brown Thomas here in Ireland, and are big retailers in Canada. And I worked for Morrison's in the United Kingdom. So I've been in retail my entire career, but I always wanted to come back to Ireland, and I've always loved aviation. I've got a pilot's license, and when the opportunity came up to join DAA, I jumped at it.
So what did you learn from your international retail experience that you were able to bring into the DAA?
Well, there's 2 things. So DAA has 2 businesses. It's got an airports business, so for example, Dublin and Cork here in Ireland, but we also operate airports in Cyprus and Saudi Arabia. We're big investors in Dusseldorf Airport, but we also have a very successful duty-free business that operates in 15 different countries. So obviously, the retail side was very transferable. On the aviation side, in terms of the airports, I'd like to think that I've brought my expertise in operations, because essentially when you're in retail, it's about moving products through a very complex supply chain, no different in the aviation sector. And of course, the people management side, Carl, I think is very transferable across many businesses.
And of course, any move into a new sector can be challenging. So what particular aspect of the move and that transition from retail into aviation did you personally find challenging?
Well, I found it really interesting, the whole economics in terms of attracting airlines into airports. And you're trying to build a business, you're trying to build routes. It's a very competitive market. We would be competing, Dublin, for example, would be competing against all the other major airports across Europe to attract an airline in. So if you're Cathay Pacific and you want to route from Hong Kong into Europe, everybody's trying to attract Cathay to fly to their airport, Copenhagen or Manchester or Dublin. So I found that very interesting, just understanding that. The other thing that was very interesting is retail is relatively short term. You build a warehouse for the next 10 to 15 years. We're working on our 2050 plans already. So I found that most unusual, but I think now 4 years into the role, starting to get a grasp of it.
You mentioned the importance, of course, of attracting new airlines and routes to the airport itself. Those opportunities, are they usually identified by the airlines whereby they see an opportunity for a particular route? Or is it the other way around?
It's more likely to be the latter. And actually, they have a speed dating event called Routes that happens a couple of times a year, which is where the airlines and the airports get together. And it's literally speed dating, and you move from where one airport meets one airline, and you kind of move around the room. But in some of these big strategic routes, and I'll use China, for example, and obviously the impact of the pandemic, pre the pandemic, our business development team had done an extraordinary job in sort of opening up China. Now, actually, they take a very Team Ireland approach. We would involve, I know you had the Taoiseach on recently. On one trip, we went out with the Taoiseach. You might be there with the IDA, you'd be there with the ambassador, speaking to the airlines and talking to them about the opportunity to fly, let's say, from Hong Kong to Dublin or from Beijing to Dublin, size of the market, the traffic flows between the two, the industry development, etc. But you're very much competing against every other major city, as I said, because an airline has it's trying to join 2 points on a map with the ultimate movable asset.
On the topic of routes, how much damage was done as a result of the pandemic in terms of frequency to locations across the world and also in terms of connectivity to those particular areas?
Well, it's had a devastating blow to Ireland, and we're obviously an island nation, and we are utterly dependent on aviation to connect to the rest of the world. So if you take Dublin Airport, for example, it would have connected to 200 cities pre-pandemic. That dropped down to as low as 22 cities last year. Now we're building back up, and we're connected back to 130 cities. But there's still a long way to go from 130 to 190. So we were reaching out to, in countries, that's 42 countries down to 11 countries. So it's going to take time. And I use that Cathay Pacific Hong Kong example. That route's gone. I'm not sure when we're going to be able to get that back up. Shanghai, we were just launching Shanghai as the pandemic hit. That's gone. And those sorts of routes, Carl, they really give Ireland a strategic competitive advantage. A country like Ireland with a direct route into Shanghai. You've got urban areas like Lyon, which is the second largest urban area in France, has no direct connecting traffic to the US. And there we were getting direct traffic into Beijing. So a real concern. But look, we're going to have to build back and focus on it. It's going to take a Team Ireland approach. We're going to need every minister that's got a valid passport on a plane with us going out there, shaking things up.
So, Dalton, that's the impact on connectivity. But what about frequency? That must have been vastly reduced as a result.
Oh, totally. And look, you don't have to look far. Just look at London, where you would have had frequency at least every hour, sort of 24, 28 flights a day. And now even Heathrow has got a relatively thin schedule. There is a lot of capacity in the market, though, because the load factors today, Carl, are having dropped down to load factors for your listeners who don't know, it's the percentage of people that are on that flight versus the full capacity of that flight. And obviously that drives the profitability of the route. Load factors were down in the 30%. Now they've crept back up to the 70%, which is very encouraging. But it still means there's quite a lot of capacity. So airlines are going to be cautious, Carl, about putting on more frequency until we see that load factor increase further.
In your estimation, how long do you think it will take to recover both the connectivity and the frequency of flights back into Dublin Airport?
Well, I would say the following, Carl. I'll give you the short term and the long term. So if we look across Europe, the analysis would suggest that by the end of this year, we'll be back to about 80% of 2019 levels. I'm talking about Europe as a whole. So that's really encouraging. So 80% of the traffic flows that we had in 2019 by the end of this year. Very encouraging. If you look at the longer term, most commentators feel it's going to take until 2024 to return to 2019 levels. And in terms of frequency and connectivity, I mean, both of those will feed into that. But there are going to be marked shifts in how people travel. Now, in Ireland, we are fortunate because 80% of all the traffic in and out of Ireland is what's called VFR, visiting friends and relatives, or leisure, and only 20% is business. So some of the structural shifts that are going on with your listeners who are obviously using video conferencing a lot more now, that's going to play out, but it's only going to be 20% of the traffic flows that will be impacted by that. But it's going to be 3 or 4 years, Carl, until we're back to pre-pandemic levels.
At the onset of the pandemic in March 2020, you quickly set about raising €1 billion in liquidity. How did you raise this amount and how critical was it for the overall survival of the airport?
Well, we would have gone to the wall had we not raised it. It's as simple as that. Now, we are state-owned, but to all intents and purposes, and having run PLCs prior to joining DAA, we run this organization as a fully autonomous commercial organization. And that's been the culture of the business through successive leadership teams. So we had to quickly, as I said, fill our boots with cash because we didn't know how bad it was going to be. What we did know is from basically March 17th last year, we started losing €1 million every single day. So we raised €1 billion. We went out to the bond market. We raised €500 million, 12-year money at 1.6%. So good pricing there. We went to the EIB, took another 350 million. We went to our banks, got another 150 million. But it was relatively straightforward raising that amount of money, because going into the pandemic, our team and our CFO had done an absolutely extraordinary job in managing our finances. So we went into the pandemic with a very strong balance sheet. Had that not been the case, Carl, we'd have gone to the wall.
And of course, having that state support behind the organisation was absolutely fundamental to raising that money, I've no doubt. Now, back to the frequency and bringing back routes, would you like to see government providing financial incentives to airlines to attract them into providing more connectivity?
But we lost €300 million last year. And I know you said the state's behind us, but we wouldn't see it that way, in the sense of we run fully autonomously. We raise money in the debt markets like any other commercial organization. So we're going to have to prime the pump. The question is, where does that support come to? If you take Dublin Airport, we have arguably the lowest airport charges of any major airport in Europe. So we're the Aldi or the Lidl of airport charges. So we're not in a position to reduce our charges any further. Do the airlines need incentives to get traveling again? They absolutely do. But the whole ecosystem is crying out. And I think government, we would obviously welcome supports into the sector. We are asking for supports into the sector for airlines, ground handlers, airports, to start priming the pump again. It's so critical that we get aviation flowing again.
And with all restrictions expected to be removed by October 22nd, what are your development plans for the DAA in a post-COVID world?
Well, we obviously have to plan for the future. And as I said, we're thinking 2050, but we have 2030 is right around the corner, and your listeners won't thank us if there are huge capacity constraints at the airport in 2026 or 2027. They'll be saying, what were DAA doing all this time? So we have to, on one hand, manage every single cent that goes through our business and control our costs. On the other side, we need to be aware that aviation does bounce back, and it has through oil crises and ash cloud crises and 9/11, etc. So we are very focused on completing the third runway, which is in construction at the moment. It'll be the fastest built runway. It started in 2019. It'll be completed by August next year. It'll be the fastest built runway and the most cost-efficient runway built in Europe in 2 decades, by far. So once we complete that, Dublin will have 3 runways, and that will allow huge capacity to come into it, so that we can further attract other airlines into Ireland.
And I know that you recently said that showing your own vulnerability to staff was an important part of the communication strategy during the pandemic. Provide us with an insight into the importance of that.
Well, we employ 8,000 people, 4,000 in Ireland and 4,000 internationally, and we had to say goodbye to a third of our team. So that's hard. Everybody in our team took for a year a wage cut of somewhere between 25% and 45%, every single member from the board down. So there was real pain, and there was huge fear and uncertainty within the organization about what the future was. And in the old days, in aviation, you could strut into work anywhere in the aviation sector and say, look, I work in the aviation sector. You know, it's only going one way. And suddenly everybody in the sector was feeling demonized, and job losses and real uncertainty. So we had to be clear with our team exactly what was going on, and we would have communicated. We put a daily email out to our team every single day, 7 days a week, right through it. We would have had conference calls to our 500 managers 2 and 3 times a week. I put a personal video out every single week, and continue to do that. I haven't missed that since the start of the pandemic. And you can't be too corporate in it. You've got to be open, because our team are They don't take nonsense. This is a team who are very passionate about what they do. And if you're not vulnerable and show your own vulnerabilities, you'll get eaten up.
And of course, DAA is a unionised environment. So how much support did you get from the unions during that process?
Look, our union partners are key to us, and having worked in so many different countries and many years in Germany, I'm very familiar with the partnership that you can have with the unions. And we were very transparent with our unions exactly about the situation we've been in. Now, fortunately, prior to this, we've been really working on developing that two-way partnership with our union partners. We had to change the methods in how we work. Well, we had to let a lot of people go, and we had to change how we work in our operation. And we sat down with our unions, and 93% of our team members voted for the changes that we wanted to introduce, which would allow people to leave the business, but would also give us a platform to build going forward in terms of new work procedures. And so we couldn't have got through this without the union.
And Dalton, as you say, you had to leave a third-year workforce go because of the pandemic. So how straightforward the process is it going to be to ramp back up to meet that increasing demand as time goes on?
Well, look, that's the $6 million question, Carl, because I don't know what my forecast is going to be. So I don't know what the traffic's going to be. And we started seeing traffic increase from the 19th of July when restrictions were dropped. The team did an outstanding job getting the business ready. I'm talking about all our airports, all our retail locations. But it hasn't been without its challenges, and we've had some difficult days, and we have disappointed some customers, on certain times, because the ramp up is we're working our way through that. People are presenting earlier. Traffic flows are different. Days, Sundays now become a critical day. It hadn't been before. So there is uncertainty, and then of course you can't just go out and hire people again because you're not sure what the traffic flows are going to be, and that creates uncertainty. At the same time, we don't want to let passengers down. So we're just working our way through that. And I think that's going to be the same for so many different businesses in the service sector, Carl, as they find their feet.
I suppose the solution to that really is your partnership with the airlines to be able to share as much information and data as possible so that you can predict a few weeks or a few months ahead in terms of what the passenger flows are going to be through the airports.
Oh, look, and we're fully aligned with that. And actually, what surprised me, you asked me earlier about my time in retail and then coming over to the airlines or to aviation. In retail, you would have shared everything with your supplier. So you, as a retailer, you'd have sat down with Procter & Gamble or Unilever or Coca-Cola, and there would have just been absolute transparency of information because all that mattered was getting the right product on the right shelf at the right time. I hadn't found that when I came into the aviation sector. There is still quite a lot of mistrust between different players. I'm not talking about in Ireland between DAA and the airlines. I'm talking about in general. So we've been working on that, and actually we're very aligned. If you take our two largest partners here, Ryanair and Aer Lingus, there's been very good supply of information two-way because they can absolutely help us and we can help them as we share information. And I think it's going to be something you're going to see more and more as the industry evolves and figures out it's got to work closer and in tandem with its partners to get through this.
Well, if you've just tuned in, that was Dalton Philips, the Chief Executive of the Dublin Airport Authority, and I'd like to thank Dalton for sharing a fascinating insight into the aviation sector with us this morning.
Southeast Radio's Business Matters with Carl Fitzpatrick.